Preparing your lab environment. Now, in this nugget, we're going to kind of do some preliminary work, things that you'll need to have in place before you start the main kind of educational nuggets that are coming up next. You really do want to have a lab available so you can try some of the things I'm showing you, experiment with them, get used to their different options, and so forth. So I'm going to walk you through some of the things you'll need to get your lab set up and some of the little prerequisite tasks you'll want to have done before you really dive in. Now, I'm not going to take up a lot of your time here. There's just a few little preliminary things to get out of the way. I want to show you the topology that I've built for my lab environment so that as I'm flinging commands and doing things to servers, you kind of have a feel for how everything's set up. I also want to offer you a couple of options for cheaply and quickly building a lab environment for yourself. If you've got one at work that you can use, that's probably best. But if you're doing this on your own and you need a way to quickly get several machines up and running so you can test some of the things I'm going to be showing you, well, I'll give you some ideas. And I'm also going to show you how to do some basic configuration of PowerShell remoting. Now, this series isn't about PowerShell at all. The problem is PowerShell is the underlying kind of plumbing that makes a lot of Windows Server 2012's admin tools work. So we've got to make sure that this remoting technology is configured right so that the tools can communicate with each other and that we can actually manage our servers. All right, to start with, here's the lab environment I've set up, and I recommend you set up something similar. I know this seems like an awful lot of virtual machines to have to set up, but trust me, this is kind of what you have to get to for this exam. And if you think this is bad, look at the setup for the exam for 7414. It's awful. The majority of what I'm going to be doing are in these two machines, my domain controller and a client computer. Now, the client computer is, of course, running Windows 8. All of my servers are running Windows Server 2012. I am going to be doing a little bit with this server member 1. It's just a member server. I'll be adding roles to it, taking them off of it, just so I have a second machine. There's a lot of things we're going to talk about that involve failover and clusters and sets, and you need two machines for that. This machine over here, I named SC because we are going to be diving slightly into System Center a little bit. We have to look at Virtual Machine Manager services, and a lot of the System Center stuff typically has to be deployed on its own standalone machine. So this is also a member of my little domain, which incidentally I have called company.local. Now, if you're looking to set up a lab and you don't want to have to build all these things from scratch, I have a couple of options to suggest for you. One of them is going to cost you a little bit of money. The other one is going to cost you a little bit of effort. So you can kind of decide which side of that you want to fall down on. Now, the first of these won't necessarily cost you anything at all, but it will require maybe a little bit of effort, and that's Microsoft itself. They provide trial software for Windows Server 2012 and for the different System Center components. Usually when these things first come out, all you can download are ISO images, DVD images, to do the install by yourself. And I'm just going to look here real quick and see what we've got. Yeah, this is what you want to look for, is the evaluation VHD. So what Microsoft has done there is they've taken an environment, they've set it up for you. It's all ready to run, and it's in a virtual hard disk file. So you can download that to any Hyper-V server. Now, Hyper-V server is, of course, a free product, so you can drop that on there and get ready to use it. Now, if you already have something like VMware Workstation or something like that, they can usually convert that VHD over to their format. So it's a quick way to get the product up and running without having to install it. Of course, given that you're looking at, an MCSE or an MCSA exam, maybe installing it yourself would give you a little bit of useful extra experience, but it's a matter of getting up and running quickly. You'll find the same sort of thing for System Center. And I believe this is just going to probably be, this is just an ISO because there's so many different products. There's probably some separate VHDs if you dig into there. Now, the other approach, and this is one that I actually use quite a bit, although this does cost you money after the trial period, is called cloudshare.com. And it's not available in every country, but if it's available in yours, it's pretty nice. What it lets you do is set up a virtualization environment with up to, I think, 6 virtual machines. And you can see over here I get a certain amount of RAM, 16 gigs, I can distribute across those, a certain amount of hard disk storage, certain number of CPUs that I can allocate. And all of these things talk to one another. They'll only stay up by default in the base plan. They'll only stay up for about an hour of idle time, which means when you're not actively working in the environment, they suspend, and then you can come back later and resume them, which is what it's doing right now. So this isn't intended to run your production environment, but it is a great lab environment. They've got a bunch of templates so that you can actually add virtual machines, and they're completely pre-installed. So you don't have to run through the installation or anything else. You get the whole OS up and running, and then you can start installing roles and configuring and modifying and playing around with it. You can create a snapshot of the entire environment. So if you kind of get everything the way you like it, and then you snapshot it, and then you play with it and mess it up, you can, in like 5 minutes, roll back to that snapshot for the entire environment, and it stays consistent. Now, you may have similar capabilities at work. You might have some virtualization infrastructure at work that you can spin up this type of environment, and if you do, that's great. It's probably easier. It'll probably not cost you anything at all. But if you don't, if you're doing this from home, this is a pretty inexpensive way of putting up some seriously powerful virtual machines. I've done quite a lot with this environment, and you'll actually see me use virtual machines from this environment as we move through some of these different nuggets. Now, the first thing you're going to want to do, especially if you're going to be working primarily from a Windows 8 machine, talking to your Windows 2012 machines, which is how I recommend you do things, is download the Windows 8 RSAT, the Remote Server Administration Toolkit. It's a free download from Microsoft. And this puts all of the GUI server administration tools as well as all the server PowerShell commands on your client computer. Now understand something here. Microsoft's way forward is for you to do all of your management on your client computer. So in this case, I'm going to be using Windows 8. You don't log on to your server consoles. The more you can force yourself to work within that model, the easier of a time you will have kind of conforming to the Microsoft way, which is definitely important as you think about exams. So kind of avoid the temptation to just always log right onto your server virtual machine console and do everything locally. Now, you're going to see me do that plenty as we move through some of these nuggets, and in some cases, it's just a matter of logistics. Sometimes I can't have enough virtual machines running on my system to get Windows 8 up at the same time as all the servers, and so I have to do stuff on the server console because it's all I can get running. That doesn't reflect a production environment reality. It's just the logistics of a lab environment sometimes. But by and large, whenever I can, I'm going to run all of my consoles right here from Windows 8. Just to kind of give you a little bit of a context here, some wayfinding, because there's no start menu in Windows 8, you're going to hit the Windows key on your keyboard. This will bring you into the, whatever we're calling this, the Metro desktop. And if you scroll slightly to the side, you'll see that the Administrative Tools folder shows up because I've installed the RSAT. Clicking that takes you right back into the good old desktop, and you can find your tools. For example, one of the big ones I'm going to be in quite a bit is Server Manager. Now, Server Manager actually runs PowerShell under the hood for just about everything that it does. So it needs to be able to talk to your remote servers via PowerShell remoting. And the good news is that PowerShell remoting is enabled by default on Windows Server 2012, and so Server Manager running on your client should natively be able to talk to those machines, particularly if you make sure that your servers and your client computer are all in the same domain within your lab. That will take care of all the authentication stuff. If you're not running your lab as a whole domain environment, you're going to have a lot harder time making it work, frankly, and you're not going to be experiencing the technology in quite the way that Microsoft planned for. So again, if your goal is to kind of wrap your head around the Microsoft way to do this, which should be your goal right now, then definitely have all of your lab machines together in a domain environment. There's one other thing that I found I had to do, though. Now, there's this thing with PowerShell remoting called the double hop. Visio is probably a much better way to explain what I mean here. So let's say I'm sitting here on my client computer. This is me, little happy face. At least I'm happy for right now. And I'm using, let's say, Server Manager. And I'm establishing a remote connection over to one of my member servers so I can install some roles, configure something, whatever else. Now let's say that part of that configuration process requires that server to talk to my DNS server, which I happen to have running on my DC. My DC is running DNS, common enough in a domain environment. I also have a DHCP server over there just for some infrastructure support. This is where the double hop happens. You see, my credential with PowerShell remoting is able to be delegated securely across the network so that member one can perform whatever tasks I'm asking it to do as me. It performs them using my credential. So whatever permissions I have, it's able to do. The problem is when it needs to reach out to another machine, by default, that second hop, that my credential can't delegate across that. So member one winds up asking the DNS server in this example to do something, only it has no permission to do it. It can't send any credentials along the way. Basically, member one is getting up to here and saying, hey, I'm an anonymous person. Would you create some new DNS records for me? And the DC says, no, I won't. And so it all kind of falls apart. There is a way to make this work, and I'm going to show you how to do that because it's something you'll probably want to set up not only in your lab environment, but quite probably in your production environment too, once you start deploying these technologies. Now you can perform these steps pretty much in any order that you want to. There's no sequence that has to happen here. And incidentally, it's completely possible for you to deploy all of these settings in a production environment via a group policy object. In fact, I'll show you where I've documented all that. I have a website called PowerShellBooks.com, and there's a free ebook on here. You don't have to log in or anything for it. It's just in a zip file called Secrets of PowerShell Remoting. That's going to walk through this same configuration process I'm showing you, but it's also going to show you how to do it via GPO. So if you want to read that, you can. So what I'm going to do is launch PowerShell. Make sure it says administrator in the title bar. If it doesn't say administrator, then you've gotten snagged by user account control, and you are going to want to right-click and run as administrator. Make sure it says administrator. And the command we're going to run is enable wsman cred SSP. And so enable wsman cred SSP. I'm on the client computer, so I'm going to specify that it has the role of client. And when you do this on the client, you also have to specify your delegate computers. And what I'm going to say is star.company.local, meaning every computer in my domain. Here's what this command is going to do. It says that when I choose to use the cred SSP authentication protocol, and I'll show you how to do that in just a moment too, my credential is allowed to not only delegate to the computer I connect to, but if the computer I connect to has a name that matches this pattern, star.company.local, meaning every computer in my domain, then that computer is trusted to delegate my credential another step. And so that would solve the double hop problem. So I'm going to run this. This is security sensitive, so it does ask you to confirm. And it does tell me that this has now been enabled and my cred SSP protocol is turned on. Excellent. So the second piece of this is on the server. Open PowerShell, enable wsman cred SSP role server. That's all you have to do on the server side of things. This enables the server to receive a credential that can then be delegated. So the client has to be allowed to send a redelegatable credential, and the server has to be configured to receive such a thing. Yep, I'm sure. And this tells me that cred SSP is enabled, and we should be good to go. So the way you actually utilize that is, and that was my domain controller that I was on just then, so I would say enter PS session, give it the computer name, and make sure I specify the authentication as cred SSP. Whoops, can't process. Requests have to include a username and a password when you use the cred SSP authentication mechanism. So here's how you do that. Specify credential. Give it your username, company, and you can do this with the domain /username format. It's going to prompt me for my password. And again, failed with the following. The WinRM client cannot process the request because the computer policy doesn't allow the delegation of user credentials to the target computer. And it's actually giving me the group policy object I need to change. This is really common in a default environment because a default environment is pretty locked down by default. This is the last step that you would have to perform. So if you want to do this, you can go in, modify that group policy object, reboot your computers, or refresh your group policy by running GP update, and then it will allow you to run this command, connect to the, in this case, my domain controller, connect to the first computer, that's your first hop, and it will allow that computer to delegate your credentials again across the network, that second hop. This isn't something that you have to do in every single environment, but I'm finding it's becoming more and more common. And as you start really working with some configuration stuff, you're going to see where this comes in with IP address management, for example. It can definitely be useful to have it configured up front. You may also want to enable remoting on your client computer so that other computers can remote into your client. Remoting is enabled by default on Windows Server 2012, but it's not enabled by default on Windows 8. So to do that, enable PS remoting. Now there's one thing that can catch you here, and I'm not sure if I'll see it, but is this it? Yes, this is it. One of the things this does, as it says here, is to enable a Windows Firewall inbound rule exception so that the incoming remoting traffic can make it through. The problem you will run into a lot is if you have a network adapter set to public. And here's the key error message. The firewall exception has been created, but it won't work because one of the network connection types is set to public. And the way the Windows Firewall works is it won't permit firewall exceptions on a public network connection. There's a couple of ways around this. This gives you one good way. Change the network connection type to either domain or private and try again. And I'll show you what I'm talking about here. Let's open the Network and Sharing Center. And you'll see here that I actually do have two networks. And that's because I configured this virtual machine with two NICs. The first is my public network. This is the one that's causing a problem. I've got a second that's a public network. See, they're both, even my private connection, which is connected to my domain, has been identified as a public network. And I did that to trigger that error message deliberately. So you just need to make sure that you don't have any set to public. I'll tell you where this can really get you is if you've installed something like VMware Workstation on your computer, and it creates a bunch of virtual network adapters. You never really connect those to anything, but they all wind up being public, and you can't actually see them because they're not real, but they're set to public, so they stop all this from working. Another thing you can do is enable PS remoting, skip the network profile check. It's all good now. And then we'll just answer yes to all to let it set up the next few things. That's kind of an easy workaround. Now that skip network profile check is new in PowerShell version 3, so don't go trying that on an older computer that only has PowerShell version 2 installed. Or at least don't try it and expect it to work, because it won't. But that's an easy way around it. You can get into the network firewall, or the Windows firewall. Let's see, Windows firewall. Advanced settings will let you get into any of your exceptions and stuff. In your lab environment, if you're having problems with it, just turn it off. Turn the whole firewall off for domain, for private, for public. Shut it off completely, and that'll get your remoting working. Obviously not something you're necessarily going to do in a domain production environment, but you're less likely to run into these little issues in a production environment because the network profiles tend to configure themselves more accurately than they do in a lab. So if it's giving you hassle and you just don't want to deal with it, and you're in a lab environment, just shut the firewall off and let it get over it. And the last thing I'll leave you with is the software you're going to need. We looked at some of this already, but start by getting a copy of Windows 8 for yourself. If you don't already have a copy, or if you don't have an MSDN or TechNet subscription that you can use to get a copy, you can come download a 90-day trial. And you're definitely going to want to have that to play with. This is targeted at developers, but it's the same Windows 8 as everybody else uses, so just download that. You're going to need Windows Server 2012. Again, if you want to download this and install it yourself, download the ISO, set up a virtual machine from scratch, actually set up 2 or 3. Or if you want a little bit of a shortcut, you can download the Evaluation VHD. And these are also trials, so they're not going to last forever, but it should get you through your lab time. And finally, you're going to want to download System Center Virtual Machine Manager. Now, the main way you wind up doing this, if you've got a TechNet subscription or an MSDM subscription, you can download just, and they actually listed on this page, let's see, just the System Center 2012 Unified Installer. That's a little tiny utility that lets you install the different System Center components. If you download this download, you're actually getting the entire private cloud eval. It actually runs on Windows Server 2008 R2. That's totally fine. Mixed environments are a very real-world thing. For the purposes of this series of nuggets, if not every machine in your lab is running Windows Server 2012, that's cool. That'll actually help you experience more of the interoperability stuff. But at the end of the day, all you really need is a server, 2008 R2 or 2012, running System Center 2012 Virtual Machine Manager. Now, if you look at the exam outline for 7413, it actually specifically refers to, and I've got it here, what's it say? Plan and deploy virtual machine manager services. Some folks will take that to think, okay, well, there's System Center Virtual Machine Manager, but then there's this other thing called Virtual Machine Manager Services. No, it's not. It's just System Center 2012 Virtual Machine Manager. That's what you want to deploy. That's what you want in your lab environment. That's part of what you're going to be tested on for 7413. So get those 3 bits of software in place. Keep in mind that Virtual Machine Manager does require SQL Server. So even the free Express edition of SQL Server will do. And this unified installer can actually help you get all of that garbage set up. Don't plan to have that installed on a machine with anything else. It's going to need its own virtual machine to live on and run on. That's why in my environment, I built myself a domain controller, a standalone member server, not standalone, but a member server just to kind of play with, and a second member server to put all the System Center stuff onto. Those are the things you're going to need to kind of get your lab environment to the point where you are able to pretty much follow along and do most of the stuff that I'm showing you. So there you have it. You kind of have an idea of what my lab looks like now. You've got maybe a couple of ideas for how to get a lab up and running for yourself pretty quickly if you need to. And I show you a couple of really basic PowerShell remoting configurations. And that wasn't intended to be comprehensive by any stretch. I kind of wanted to give you as little as possible to get you where you might need to be. You can read that Secrets of PowerShell Remoting ebook if you want to dive deeper into that particular topic. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.